Hi everyone, so while I normally do analysis videos on trial character builds, I thought I'd do something different this time. Normally my content is aimed more or less at two different types of viewers. The first type is generally the type of player who is simply curious about a character and if they want to make a spot for them on their team. Since I generally just give general facts about the character traits and abilities and how they are being advertised in terms of playstyle, I mainly leave it up to the viewer to ultimately make that decision for themselves based on the information. The second type of viewer is someone who just really likes the character and wants to find encouraging information that allows them to make that character the best they can be. While I try to remain grounded and set correct expectations about character details, I never intend to use math as a means of proving that a character isn't worth your time. If you're on the internet looking up information on a character, it's likely due to being stuck on a character build and how that character can fit on your team. Or you're seeking confirmation bias, which can be either positive or negative. Since I don't really focus much on min-maxing or putting down characters based on what could be deemed as lackluster performance, I likely don't fill the needs of the meta category of viewers. However, I have the confidence that meta players know a good deal about the game mechanics and can sort for themselves what they want out of a character, so if they're willing to just deal with some general facts, I'm sure they can go from there. That being said, this video is going to be very different. While I normally steer clear of telling you how to build a character, Albedo is a very special character to me. You may recall a time when I used him as my face during character analysis videos, and that's because I see him as a very analytical person, and that really resonates with me. Couple that with the Misty Dungeon event exposing me to his playstyle, and it was definitely a match made in heaven. So this time, I wanted to make a more or less comprehensive guide to Albedo. I'm going to be outlining his talents, talking about different builds you can try, and even going over his weapon choices. So if you're here to celebrate Albedo and you don't mind a little bit of emotional bias, strap yourselves in, because we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about our alchemist friend. So the first thing we should know is that Albedo is a sword-wielding character with a Geo Vision. His normal attacks have no infusion without other character assistance, so the majority of time Albedo will be attacking with physical damage. Since Albedo isn't typically used with physical DPS builds, we won't be worrying too much about that particular aspect about him, but if you want to build him for physical DPS with your Aquila Favonius, simply because you think his attack animations are stylish and just want to do it, fair enough. Give it a try. Albedo's most important skill, and most significant source of damage, however, comes from his elemental skill, the Solar Isotoma. Summoning the Isotoma summons a cute little alchemic flower that generates a large AoE geofield. All damage that happens within this field triggers an Isotoma Blossom, which deals geo damage that scales with Albedo's defense stat. That's right, a character who can use a main stat that isn't attack. Praise the artifact gods, because you can actually use the other half of the artifact drops you receive. Now watch, as all your future drops have attack percent. I suppose you can give them to Ningguang. It's important to note that the Isotoma flowers can be triggered every 2 seconds and can happen even if Albedo isn't currently on the field. This means that you can set the Solar Isotoma and swap to your other DPS character and deal additional instances of damage alongside the amount that they normally deal. Couple this with the fact that it has an uptime of 20 seconds and a cooldown of 4, Albedo's Isotoma field has 100% uptime. Now, I do have to at least provide the following disclaimer. Just like Zhongli's Pillar, certain boss attacks can cause the Solar Isotoma to vanish and render Albedo's usefulness as an additional damage dealer to rubble, which is a constant source of annoyance for Albedo mains everywhere. In these cases, we do have other options that make Albedo more reliable, but it will focus on burst builds, which we'll talk about later. Speaking of, Albedo's burst is such an interesting one, and it calls for an additional reality check for those of us who have thus far swooned for our fluffy-haired alchemist. His burst scales off of his attack stat. Now, it does have moderately decent scaling. At level 8, it's in the 500 range, and while you're inside his Solar Isotoma field, it deals additional instances of damage, so there's potential for pretty amazing burst damage. However, this is often a point of contention with most players, and a commonly used phrase when describing Albedo as a character is what most refer to as split scaling. There's the common assertion that Albedo shouldn't need to balance between both his attack stat and his defense stat to deal good damage. And while this is true, since Albedo is mainly an off-field damage dealer anyway, I don't really see this as a problem. Albedo's design on the whole suggests that his true power lies in his skill damage, and I'd much rather go all in on defense to prioritize more consistent damage dealing across the board, and I don't see it so much as something that needs fixing, because let's face it, if MiHoYo also scaled his burst off his defense, his scaling would probably be much lower, and they'd change up the effect on his C2 to be a little less potent. Speaking of his C2, for those of you a little less concerned over finances, this split scaling does have a built-in fix in the form of his second constellation, which tacks on additional damage to his elemental burst based on up to 120% of his defense. This is, of course, another point of contention that players refer to as constellation-locked damage. This refers to the phenomenon where more than 30% of a character's full power must be obtained through a higher level constellation, forcing players to pull for the character multiple times in order to enjoy a more maximized playing experience. Again, in my honest opinion, I don't see the split scaling as nearly as much an issue since I focus more on his skill damage anyway. If you're in a time crunch and see his burst as a DPS loss, you'd probably sooner not use it and focus more on his off-field damage anyway. If you're more casual and don't mind the time it takes to cast his burst, you'll just see it as extra damage. Hey, I warned you, this video probably comes off as biased. For the last of Albedo's talents, he has the ability to deal additional skill damage to weakened enemies, his burst bestows elemental mastery to his teammates, and he has a chance to double weapon materials. Now it's time to talk about builds. I've got a couple different categories depending on what you want to focus on. I'll talk about them in the order of power level. Of course, perception of power is fairly subjective, so you may have your own order preferences. The first set is what I call the Boss Slayer, or the burst build. In situations where you're facing off against bosses that tend to destroy your solar isotoma to a frustrating degree, you might want to focus on dealing damage at the right time with burst damage. You'll want a good energy recharge weapon, and focus on an attack percent crit build. The attack percent will benefit your burst damage, and the energy recharge will allow you to use your burst more often. In a multiplayer situation, it's important to note that the summoning of your isotoma deals damage that scales off your attack. So, since it's likely going to be destroyed anyway, go ahead, lay that sucker down at the boss's feet for extra damage. If you're looking for maximum damage, you'll want to use the 2-piece Archaic Petra and the 2-piece Noblesse set. If you don't mind losing out on some damage and acting as a buffer, you can use the 4-piece Noblesse set to grant more attack to the rest of your team. And since Albedo grants more elemental mastery after using his burst, you can put him in a team with your favorite Melt or Vaporize combination to take advantage of the added reaction damage. In all other instances, we want to focus more on Albedo's defense stat, but it's a matter of what you want your set bonuses to be. This determines Albedo's overall role in your team. In terms of support, Tenacity of the Millelith is still king. It allows Albedo to deal off-field damage and still benefit the remaining members of your party with an attack buff. Albedo also benefits from this attack buff, but it only really benefits the initial recasting of his elemental skill and his elemental burst. Since there isn't strong enough focus on using his burst, you'll want to aim for defense sands and defense substats alongside your crit rate and crit damage. This leaves your 4th substat to be pretty much whatever, so long as it doesn't get rolled into too often should it be deemed to be an undesirable stat. The next build takes a little detour into a different realm of damage dealing. For this segment, we're going to be talking about an Elemental Mastery build. Now, a lot of people shy away from Elemental Mastery when it comes to Geo characters since crystallization is only good for producing shields. It's also not very predictable, so if shields are what you're looking for, it's probably better to just include a character in your team that can just create one on demand. It's for this reason I'm not going to be covering the 4-piece Archaic Petra set. The only thing you really need to know is it's best used for mono elemental, and Albedo has to be the one to pick up the crystallized shards. At any rate, while Elemental Mastery isn't really all that great on most Geo characters, if you're having trouble with crit rate stats, you might want to explore putting Albedo on a freeze team. Since when Geo hits a frozen enemy, it triggers the Shatter reaction, you can focus more on Elemental Mastery and less on crit rate since Shatter can't crit anyway. And with 1000 Elemental Mastery, a level 90 Albedo can deal 12,000 damage with each triggered reaction, which is on par with most moderate well-built crit builds. So, if you happen to have the Freedom Sword, or want to pull for it anyway, or maybe you've crafted the Iron Sting, you can put Albedo in a team that can constantly freeze enemies. This can be Ganyu with any Hydro Applicator, or even a team with Chongyun and Xingqiu. You can keep the Tenacity 4-piece set to keep your team buffed with extra attack, or you can just pick your best Elemental Mastery pieces and run without any set bonuses. If you like the idea of a Frozen team, but aren't so big on the Shatter reaction, you can also exchange that crit rate circlet for a crit damage circlet and take full advantage of the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer with the defense crit build that is Albedo's usual staple. Since the 4-piece set gives extra crit rate when Albedo's skill hits a frozen enemy, you don't have to worry about crit rate nearly as much, and can deal decent elemental skill damage, with an extra 2,000 or so shatter damage as icing on the cake. So let's suppose you've already got your support builds, or you want to focus more on Albedo's overall skill damage. Well, it's still going to be the same defense sands, Geo Goblet, and crit circlet like it normally is, but now we focus on set bonuses that increase his damage. Originally, one of the best sets you could give Albedo to boost his damage was a 2-piece defender set, so long as you use the feather and flower pieces, and pair that with a 2-piece archaic Petra set. Well, no more does Albedo have to deal with 4-star artifacts, because we have a shiny new 5-star set with the same 2-piece bonus that grants him extra defense. Noelle mains sing their praises as well. Quick note though, if you are a lower AR and see yourself to be as such for the foreseeable future, the 2-piece defender, 2-piece gambler set is a rough equivalent of this one. Now, this set will likely satisfy most players. It is easier to accomplish a 2-in-2 mixed set, but for perfectionists, the last bastion of elevating Albedo's damage ceiling as high as his Isotoma elevator lies within the 4-piece Husk of Opulent Dreams set. Yes, it's no surprise that in terms of dealing more damage, the new 4-piece set provides the most personal damage for Albedo amongst all the others. There's no denying that a set that stacks up to an additional 24% defense and geo damage for simply being an inactive character allows Albedo to play to his strength of taking a backseat while still dealing massive geo damage. Players who want as much Albedo field time should be warned that every 6 seconds that he remains on the field without dealing geo damage will cause his power to decline. In multiplayer applications, you'll need to deal geo damage as much as possible so you can quickly build up stacks and maintain them. Otherwise, you might want to stick with the 2-in-2 as conditional damage can be quite burdensome. Now on to the tools of the trade. So Albedo has a few weapons that are really good on him. In situations where you want to prioritize Albedo's burst, there's no denying that the Festering Desire allows you to do just that. It even makes up for the loss of skill damage focus by adding bonus damage to his Isotoma Flowers and lending extra crit rate to them as well. If you weren't able to obtain the free 4-star sword during the event last year, the Favonius sword provides energy recharge and extra energy particles upon scoring critical hits. If you're focusing on Albedo's skill damage and defense builds, look no further than the Harbinger of Dawn. As a 3-star weapon, it's easy to overlook since they don't provide a lot of attack power. However, since Albedo doesn't really need attack in this case, the crit damage substats as well as the crit rate passive benefit him quite well, provided you can keep him nice and healthy, which is very possible since he probably won't take up much field time anyway. In multiplayer situations, you might consider switching this out for the Traveler's Handy Sword if you're looking for more survivability and none of your friends play healers. It has a defense substat and it allows Albedo to heal every time he picks up energy particles. This is handy for ensuring that he stays alive for prolonged fights while still allowing him to focus on maximizing his skill damage. It's not necessarily the best option, but if survivability matters to you, this is one of your better options. Now, with a new update, MiHoYo is handing out a new weapon specifically designed with Albedo in mind. It provides a large defense substat, and its ability adds 40% of his defense to his skill damage. With free refinement materials also being present during the event, this effect will double to a hefty 80%. Since I'm pretty sure players will be concerned about diminishing returns, I did some number crunching and compared the Harbinger of Dawn and the Cinnabar Spindle, and assuming you are using the same artifact set with the same stats and substats, the Cinnabar Spindle beats out the Harbinger of Dawn in terms of skill damage, but falls behind when burst damage deals a critical hit. Even with his second constellation, though that difference is almost negligible. So with this information in mind, I'm going to have to say that the new Cinnabar Spindle will, on a more consistent basis, outperform the Harbinger of Dawn, since most builds will be prioritizing Albedo skill damage anyway. However, it still very much comes down to luck and substats. And until you have a crit rate you are satisfied with, it might be worth hanging on to your Harbinger of Dawn for just a little while longer. So that's it for this video on Albedo. I hope you found it helpful, or at the very least you looked at some of the build suggestions and found them interesting. I know not all of them will appeal to the majority of Albedo players, but I think it's important to explore numerous possibilities. That being said, I'm very sorry if you wanted more insight in the Petra set, but I don't feel comfortable enough in my abilities to give a concise guide on how to use it properly. So with that, I want to thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you in the future. I really want to get my Albedo built and make more Genshin content as an Albedo main. Maybe do some multiplayer content with randoms or friends. I hope you look forward to that, and I'll see you real soon. So until then, stay tuned.